Okay. For those of you who didn't hear, the comment was curious about uh, native accessibility for the phone, accessibility kind of in comparison, contrast mobile versus web accessibility. Does that capture your thoughts? Yep. Right. Like jQuery mobile. Right. Yep. Okay. Yeah. Good point. Last one. Okay. Okay. All right. And for that was a general ask for discussing best practices. So my name's Chris McMeeking. I am here with DQ Systems. Can we tone down some lights? Can you guys see the presentation? Okay. No. Wrong one. That's brighter. There we go. How about now? All right, all right. So, my name's Chris McMeeking. One of the things I want to just introduce myself a little bit. I'm a developer first, and then mobile accessibility expert second. I started developing in college, and then I got involved in a project that was developing an application for this little girl with cerebral palsy, and I really from that gained a passion for accessibility. Being a developer, I'm also inherently introverted. New social situations kind of little awkward, and so as I was coming into Toronto, I arrived at my hotel and I didn't know what to do. Like subtle things like where to go to dinner. They kind of scare me a little bit, like new situation, you get little anxiety. And there was a sign walking into my hotel that says, "Chris, go to Steakhouse." And I wanted to thank, I wanted to thank Toronto's advertising community for placing this sign in my hotel and making that decision easier for me because I was having a little anxiety going through traffic and everything. But anyway, that is me, and let's get on with the presentation. So if you would like to follow along, like I said, I did develop a somewhat iOS centric presentation, and there are examples on GitHub. If you would like to follow along, those are the examples that I have. I have a lot of code examples for Android as well, but later on in the presentation, I'm going to get into a really in-depth example involving table views and list views, Android, iOS. Later on, I'm going to get an in-depth presentation about how to represent complex data in mobile. It's a particularly interesting topic because it doesn't a lot of the things that exist for you in HTML and forms to do that don't exist in mobile, and you have to. There's some nice tricks we can do to make them really accessible and really useful. So, all right, so that's not what it's supposed to look like right now, guys. I hit back and I went back again, and now it's working. So just a quick outline of the presentation. I'm gonna go over some basic mobile principles. Talk to you about screen readers for a bit and how screen readers on mobile differ from screen readers on WebView. There are a few differences in how people interact with mobile technology versus how they interact with web technology. Android specific concerns, focus and hints. Focus hints versus Android and hints on iOS are different. Make sure we'll cover that. Some iOS specific concerns, traits, hints, accessibility elements. These are all things that exist only on iOS, and they're how VoiceOver syncs with your application. And then some best practices. And then later on, I'm going to go into a tables and lists demo. This is going to be a very iOS centric example. Luckily, we're mostly iOS developers. Thanks, guys. But the concepts will apply equally to Android. You can see the organizational, how you organize data, how you want to present data. It applies to mobile web, jQuery, mobile, Android. It's all the same thing. And then hopefully I'll get to talk a little bit about dynamic elements. So screen readers. Hold on a second, I need a drink. So when you talk about screen readers as per mobile development, there's a couple new concerns introduced. So first of all, when you're talking about a screen reader in mobile or in web, I remember somebody referencing the differences between mobile and web. One of the things is your standard gestures are overridden. So when you picture using a mobile device, what you have is a screen, right? And when you have a keyboard, on a web page, when you can interact with the keyboard, there's all sorts of shortcuts that they can introduce to the user that nobody is going to use. If you're using VoiceOver on Mac OS X, for example, VoiceOver can introduce all sorts of Command Shift Alt FN can do something interesting, right? But when we're talking about screen readers on mobile, we have a very limited subset of gestures. So what happens is some of those gestures that users are used to using in one way, VoiceOver, the screen reader takes those and uses them for its own means. So some of your gestures, like for example, swiping back and forth, does much like tab and shift tab would do on a keyboard. You're gonna cycle through elements, and I'll demonstrate this a little bit. I got my tablet here. But anyway, so it's going to take over some of those gestures. Some of those gestures not going to allow pass through of all your gestures. So if you have custom gestures are going to be very difficult to handle accessibly. So you want to avoid having custom gestures in your applications. And if you do, the best thing to do is just provide an alternate means. Rather than performing the gesture, provide a button somewhere that can perform whatever action that gesture is trying to supply. Which is my next point: provide alternative gestures. If you have complex gestures in your application, you need to provide an alternative way of supplying the interaction for that gesture, because it's just not, describing some type of helical gesture is just not possible. So you just have to provide an alternative way of doing that action, some button somewhere on the user interface. And then finally, developer awareness. The big thing with these screen readers is you just got to be aware that they're there. You have to, let the screen reader do its job a little bit, but at the same time, you have to provide it the information that it needs. And that's really what developing accessible, especially mobile applications, about, is just providing that little bit of information that the screen reader needs to provide that information to your users. And then the final thing is it introduces the concept of focus. When you're talking about Android has the concept of focus a little bit. You have the trackball on Android, so you're always concerned a little bit about focus when you're developing usable applications. But for iOS, there is no real concept of focus without VoiceOver, right? If you don't have VoiceOver, you're not concerned about where focus is. Maybe if it's on a text field, you might be concerned about where input is coming, but you never need to focus a button. You never need to focus a widget unless you have VoiceOver. Now suddenly you're concerned about this idea of where focus is on your application. It kind of introduces that idea to iOS. I've mentioned some things in here a little bit, but I want to make sure I touch on everything. So when you're talking about Android, you're talking about TalkBack. And TalkBack has a few features that are separate from iOS, unique to TalkBack, if you will. You have the trackball built in hardware. A lot of Android devices have the trackball, or at least they used to. This is a little bit of a legacy concept now. And when you talk about TalkBack, it focuses on doing the job for you. And what I mean by that is a lot of Android elements have a default accessibility label, if you will. So when I talk about an accessibility label, what I mean is the text that gets spoken back to you when you scan over an object. So like an alt, if you will, for web development, an alt attribute. And so what Android does is they go and they try to grab this information from the standard information that you would apply just as a usability thing. For example, if you have a button that has text in it, it will grab that and use that for you. So really, when we're talking about Android and usability and accessibility are highly, highly related. If you have a usable application in Android, you probably have a fairly accessible application in Android. That being said, it only works really well in the simple scenario. VoiceOver is a much more mature product. It requires a little more effort to develop applications for, but you can develop very, very usable, very, very assistive applications on the VoiceOver platform, whereas it takes a little more effort to trick Android into doing some of the things that VoiceOver does very cleanly. And you'll see that in my example later. All right. So before I move on, I'm just going to give a quick demonstration of how all of this connects together. Quick use VoiceOver on my tablet here. That way you guys can see everything I talk about. For those of you who may not have seen VoiceOver be used before, see what all these things that I talk about. I just want to give you an idea of what's going on. All right, let me get this set up. Can you hear me through this one too? All right. I think it might have been shut off. Where'd it go? Yeah, it got shut off. All right. Hopefully this still works. Chris's MacBook mirroring. All right, there it is. So now I'm going to turn on VoiceOver.
VoiceOver on.
All right. Oh no.
VoiceOver off.
Go away.
VoiceOver on.
All right, there we go. So
Test
I have
app
this
D.
nice test app DQ
Double tap to open.
thing that I have here.
Test
and
app
so
D.
what we have
Go.
here is we have just a basic accessibility application. I'm going to talk about the elements on here and how we label them later. But for now, I just want to give a basic overview of how VoiceOver is working. So you notice here, as I scan over the screen,
Visit Google homepage.
Right?
Google. Link.
And then what I can do also...
Visit Google homepage.
I have a bunch of versions of the same thing up here for a reason. I promise I'll get to that later. And then another thing we can do, notice we can, instead of scanning our finger around, we can flick
3
to
of
the
3
left.
Wi-Fi bars. 3:30 p.m. Orientation. Airplane.
And go through
89.
things in order, right? That's kind of fun.
Go. Visit Google.
Okay.
Link.
And this is VoiceOver
Visit
taking
Google
over these
homepage.
gestures. It's saying, all right, this gesture doesn't mean what you want it to mean. It means move forward in the focus order, similarly to DOM ordering in web.
Google.
And
Google. Link.
TalkBack has a very similar mechanism.
Visit Google
This
homepage.
is screen reader. This is some of the new ideas that it comes. One of the big things to notice here is the touch to explore. If all we were concerned about was tab keys, if all we were concerned about was going back and forth, mobile accessibility would be very
Visit
easy.
Google
the
homepage.
concepts would just be very similar to web accessibility. But we have this touch to explore thing
Visit
people
Google,
can do,
Google,
right?
Google.
And we
Link.
can, what we can do is we can set
Visit
stuff up
Google
to be very
homepage.
seamless, very usable with this touch to explore. And that's one of the things I'm going to focus on. The best practices, if you will, are going to be focusing on not only supporting people using potential hardware keyboards or potentially swiping back and forth, but touch to explore, which is very powerful and can create very usable accessibility applications. Back to the presentation. All right, so now let's talk about how to incorporate these design elements into our applications. First, the thing Android, we need labels. We need in web, this is the alt text, this is the alt attribute. We need some labels. In Android, we can associate this programmatically by doing set content description. It's called the content description. We can also do it in XML. Android-specific concerns regarding labels. Most elements don't need it. Like I said, they get it from, like, if you have a label, it's going to pull the text from that label and it will become the accessibility label. Am I still talking over here? There we go. The button text is going to be its content description by default. The times when you need to use, if you have custom controls, if you have images, you need to include a content description. And then you should consider traits. When you're talking iOS labels, they have traits separately, whereas Android doesn't really have the concept of a quote trait. So you need to consider the context of your action, the context of your item when you're adding a label and what that label content should be. And hint in Android, so a hint is a very specific thing in Android. A hint is that little bit of text in those boxes. See these text fields here? It says that it's the pretext, that little thing that queries you that says what does this text field do? For example, send message to. When you're talking about for example, the Android text application, the context, where it is a little bit pushes you at what it should do, but the hint kind of says, hey, this is what this field is. For example, how would we differentiate between these two fields as the send message field versus the send message to, so like the recipient field versus the message text? We couldn't differentiate those two from a usability standpoint without a hint, let alone from an accessibility standpoint where there's absolutely no context at all without some type of hint text in there. So that it's a good usability practice, but it's a crucial accessibility practice. That's obnoxious. All right, so Android focus. When we're talking about focus in Android, focus is always an important concept in Android, again, not only for usability, but for accessibility. Usability and accessibility are very, very linked. So we need to provide a way for a variety of users, a variety of accessibility users to interact with our application. In Android, we're worried about touch to explore, keyboard, as well as trackball users. And so we need to provide a focused direction. And so you look down here, what we do is we set this in XML. We have these 4 attributes down here at the bottom. You have next focus up, next focus left, next focus right, next focus down. Very simple. You just got to tell it where focus is going, where it should head. In general, Android provides a pretty good automatic interpretation of what this should be, but it's nice to just provide it in there for you. You know where it is. It's a best practice. You should do it. It's really easy. iOS stuff. So iOS labels, same concerns as Android labels, pretty similar way of integrating them. You can set them programmatically, set accessibility label, add the label. You can also define a function to grab the label. This is a really interesting thing, and I'll go into that more later. But providing a function that returns a string can be a very powerful accessibility concept. Again, I'll cover that more later. Interface builder, just add the label here. You see the label slot and the hint slot. Some iOS specific concerns. One of the things we're concerned about in iOS is iPad versus iPhone. Remember, if you set things in XML, you're probably going to have 2 separate XML files, one for an iPad application and one for an iPhone application. If you decide to set it in XML, you got to set it the same in both places. Let's see. Oh, so one of the things that we're concerned about is when you talk about labels. So labels on iOS, again, aren't necessary everywhere. If you look at text fields will provide their own label. Buttons will provide their own label, but it doesn't always provide a very good label. It's just the text there, which often isn't real accurate on iOS, as well as the UI table cell. What we can do with UI table cells is provide a very advanced label that incorporates all of the data within that cell. And that's something I'll go over in more depth later, because when you're talking about data association, remember that touch to explore concept. Where objects are on the screen isn't necessarily obvious, right? If we're moving around on the screen, we can make data very available by connecting it all together in one cell. That's a cool concept, and we'll talk about it later. All right, so iOS hint. Hints tell the user what interacting with an object does. What you end up with is you end up with a little pause after it reads the label. What iOS does is it'll read label, traits. So for example, the buttons in my application were labeled Google or Go, I think. So it'll read Go, link, and then some type of thing. In my case, it's going to visit the Google homepage. So that's what the hint is that last little bit of text after the pause. It says visiting Google homepage. One thing to remember about hints is it should be a properly formatted sentence. VoiceOver, they try really hard to provide proper inflection. When you listen to VoiceOver, you can actually change the way a sentence is read by VoiceOver by adding punctuation. So putting a period at the end, a question mark at the end, commas are very important when you're talking about VoiceOver because it will actually try to replicate the way a sentence is read. So bad, don't reiterate information contained in the label or trait. If something's a link, they already know it's a link. You don't have to reiterate that information. And you don't need to add in the gesture that needs to take place to perform the action. People who are using VoiceOver are used to, in fact, most of the time it's going to change what that gesture is. So, move on. Traits. So traits in iOS, this is another iOS specific thing. It tells you what the object is. Provides a little context for what an object is going to do. For example, one of the key trait discrepancies. For example, a link and a button are very similar. They're both going to provide some type of action on some type of interaction, right? But in a link case, the link is probably going to open up a browser window. So marking something a link when it's going to open up a browser window is very important because that provides context on what the action is going to do. Knowing that you're going to be changing context, that you're going to open that browser window is very important. There are certain traits that conflict. For example, you shouldn't have a button and a link be the same thing. These are conflicting traits that could be very confusing, right? You want to pick the one that's best for your context, best for what the action is going to be. Objects can have multiple traits. Two of the most popular examples here. A button can play a sound display. It can also be an image. And then labels can quote update frequently. And what this means is one of the examples. Let's say you have a stopwatch application. Okay, and this you have the stopwatch label that's constantly going to be churning up, right? It's constantly going to be updating. You don't want to flood the screen reader with information. So it is, hey, this label's updating frequently. Let it know it's updating frequently. That way you don't flood the application with unnecessary information. Some caveats about iOS. Accessibility elements are really picky. Only the outer element of an accessibility element will get focus. This isn't true 100% of the time, but it's a good rule of thumb to follow. Basically what that means is if you have, say, an encapsulating view or a group of views, if the outer view is an accessibility element, the views contained inside, if those are marked an accessibility element, VoiceOver will not focus them. Okay? Does everybody understand that? And this is actually a good thing. What this allows us to do is remember that data encapsulation thing, that data relations. We can set accessibility element on an outer cell, on an outer view, so that we can represent all of the data at once to a user. And this can be really powerful usability technique as far as accessibility is concerned. I think most of this I've already said already. So some best practices: element association. Having a single button apps aren't very interesting. So what can we do to make things scenario more interesting? For drag and explorers, how do we associate fields? When we're talking about drag and explore, say you have a column of data. You have several columns of data, maybe potentially small bits of data. And how do you associate fields together? For example, let me get my iPad back out.
Open camera. But page 1 of 2. Test app D. Go. VoiceOver off.
All right.
VoiceOver on. Test app D.
So what we have up here is you'll notice that we have this visit Google homepage followed by a go button. Okay, and what I have highlighted in yellow, those are accessibility elements. That's what those are the things that I've marked as an accessibility element. So in the first example, what we have is something that's completely broken. I'm scanning over it here, and I can't even get this visit Google homepage information. I can't even get information about that. And this go button just says go. Right, that's not very helpful. Also notice that visit Google homepage on the left and its corresponding go button aren't related in any way. So if we're using tab or going back
visit Google, visit Google,
this we can do. But if somebody just wants to touch to explore,
visit Google homepage.
It's hard to tell.
Visit
all right,
Google
so I'm
homepage.
here now. Did I go down? Did I go down
Google,
to this one?
Link.
I don't know. Did I go up to this
Google,
one? What
link.
if these are more complex bits
Visit
of data?
Google homepage.
What if these are amounts on a bank application or contacts in a list and you have them in order and you're trying to find your friend's phone number, okay? If you're doing touch to explore here, it's going to be hard to tell whether you've potentially gone up to the next contact or not, right? So what we do is down at the bottom,
Google, link.
We connect this all in one bit of
Google
information.
Homepage.
Okay, we can collect this all in one accessibility element, mark the outer view as the accessibility element so that it's all collected, it's all read out at once, right? And then if you listen to how it's read off.
Google, link. Visit Google homepage.
We have all of the information that is there visible. We have all that information available to to VoiceOver. All of it's read out, and it's also very easy to find when you're scrolling over this.
Google.
Very easy to find, very quickly.
Visit Google
very
homepage.
Usable for a touch to explore user. Any questions on what I've covered so far? So the question was, how is I grouping the label and the link? What I have is a cell view. It's just a cell view that's holding the label and a link as subviews. And then remember how I said you could define a function to return an accessibility label. What I have is just collecting that I'm collecting that information all together and saying, all right, hey, this is the text view that is contained within this cell is the hint. We can also do the same thing for hints. This is the hint, and the label is the text of the button, right? And that's really a convenient way to do that because let's say we have some dynamic content on those things, like the label is changing. if we're grabbing onto that, if we're using that function and grabbing those elements, it's never going to be wrong, right? That dynamic content, our accessibility label is going to update automatically in comparison to the text on that label. Can I show you? Can I show you? I have a better example of that in my table view code. So yeah, you will see that. Any other questions? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Screen dimmed.
So it's hard to
Screen
tell what the
locked.
reason for that would be. What it sounds like based on your explanation is so we have this connection when we're talking about mobile between web
Screen locked.
accessibility and. Hold on a second. Wait, it's locked now, so it shouldn't say that again. But I swear it said it was locked twice. So when we're talking about mobile accessibility, we have this connection between mobile accessibility and web accessibility and jQuery mobile and PhoneGap and SensorTouch and all these things that attempt to make sending out mobile applications to multiple platforms simple, but ultimately what they do is kind of complicate the issue. And I think based on what she described, what was going on was kind of this odd thing with form headings and column headings and things like that. It sounds like what's happening is that there's some type of mobile platform because right. And yeah, and so she's saying she had to drive in, and what that sounds like is some type of jQuery mobile or PhoneGap or some type of platform like that is making accessibility more difficult because a lot of these standard things should be available by default, and so that's just an educated guess. What they really should do is just say, hey, this is an accessibility element. We want to be able to share this information with the screen reader. But you got to look out for things like jQuery mobile and PhoneGap and make sure just because they should be default accessible just because they're using web views, you still have to share that information and still have to make that information available. So I already did my demo. Oh, there's another question. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Okay, the question was related to zoom text and modal windows, and when a modal window pops up, say you're zoomed in on a portion of the screen that isn't even visible when the modal window pops up, and when you're talking about that, that's a form of dynamic content. Dynamic content is always tricky. The best practice in this case is avoid dynamic content, avoid the use of modal windows when necessary. It's much simpler. But if you absolutely have to have a modal window of some kind, announce its presence. Make sure that the object that launches that modal window announces the fact that it's going to launch a modal window, and that the modal window is launched when it is announced. And most platforms do that automatically, with the exception of the prior announcement. Like if a button's going to launch a mobile window or has the ability to launch a mobile window, let people know that it can do that. Does that answer your question? Yep. Anybody else? Sorry, the people on the right side of the room. I for some reason gravitate over here. Go ahead. I hear what you're saying. So the question is it possible to draw focus to that modal window? And I'm going to use iOS for an example. The problem with iOS is unless VoiceOver is turned on, there is no concept of focus. Focus does not exist. So you can't draw focus to something if we don't care about where focus is, right? So in VoiceOver, when you have VoiceOver on, that is absolutely what happens. VoiceOver comes up and says, hey, this is a modal window, right? But if you don't have VoiceOver on, that focus doesn't exist, right? There is no focus, therefore what you just mentioned can't happen. With VoiceOver on, that's the standard behavior for iOS. That is what happens, and it would be very difficult to make it not behave that way. Anything else? I'm going to get into the more advanced topics here. So if you want explanation on some of the more simple stuff, now is the time, because I'm going to move on to tab views and list views here in iOS code. So as long as there's nothing else, let's move on. All right, so table views. One of the things we want to do with table views is, in general, we want to represent more complex data sets. They are inherently dynamic. We don't know what this data is going to be beforehand. That's a unique challenge in comparison to, say, programming a button where the text is always going to be the same thing, right? When we're programming a table view, we're populating it with, like, say, contact list, for example. A contact list is probably the biggest example. Is simple. Everybody knows what it is. So we have to support the dynamic nature of the table view, maintain people's ability to interact while maintaining usability for both keyboard users and touch to explore users. And what we're going to see is that there's two basic ways to do that. The first is to separate all the accessibility elements. Again, I'm focusing on iOS here, so we're going to talk about accessibility elements. We can let each item act on its own. This is a necessary concept if more than one object requires interaction. If we need to interact with more than one object, we have to, because you can't interact if you're going to go down to the other option where you have one accessibility element. If you have more than one object that needs interaction, obviously, if we only have one element in there, they can't interact with those objects. When we're doing this, we have to have careful consideration for touch to explore users. We want to make sure that our objects are nice and big, that they're lined up in the same cell, that we have space between the cells so that there's no confusion for touch to explore users. And then the second object is one accessibility element. Represent all the information in one element so that as a touch to explore user scrolls down, all of that information is grouped together. You can't possibly get information decoupling because all of that information is in the same cell. This is very convenient for touch to explore users, little to no downside for keyboard users. And it works very well if only one object requires interaction. So here are the, would you guys rather see the implementation first, or you want me to give my demo? If I have a demo of the finished product, do you want to see the demo and then go over the implementation, or do the implementation and then the demo? I saw a bunch of people shaking their heads when they saw demo then implementation. So I'm going to go and show you what I have, and then we'll go over the implementation and how to accomplish that. All right, get this set up again. Everybody remind me to unplug it this time, please. All right.
3:53 p.m. Page 2 of VoiceOver off.
All right. Now let's bring
VoiceOver on. Test app D.
Okay,
Test app
so
D.
what
Go.
I have here,
Next button.
What I have here is a simple contact list. I have coworkers at the top and family and friends at the bottom. What I've done is coworkers are going to represent this separate accessibility elements approach, having separated everything and making everything interactable individually. And the family and friends, you're going to see the one cell approach. So let's go here. So listen carefully.
Name, Chris McMeeking.
Cool.
Number 73446455506. Launches alert button.
We're going to have a button that launches the alert.
Oh, you pushed a button.
So somebody mentioned the idea of shifting focus to a modal view, right? That's what just happened, right? We have this alert that pops up. VoiceOver shifted focus directly to the modal view, told us about it.
Go away button.
And go away because those things
Launches
are
alert.
obnoxious.
Button.
So now,
Name, Chris
remember
McMeeking.
what we were talking about is when we're talking about touch to explore users, notice how close together these data elements are when you're talking about height, right? So one of the things that we're worried about is as a touch explorer.
Co-workers heading.
If we're
Name,
here,
Chris McMeeking. Number 7 7.
you can
7,
very easily
6,
make that
6,
mistake,
6,
right?
5 5 5.
Going
5.
from my name here,
Chris McMeeking.
touch to explore,
number,
and just explore down just
7,
half
7,
an inch,
7,
not even
6,
half an inch,
6,
and you've
6,
selected the wrong
5,
number, right?
5.
And
Name,
we can take
Chris
care of this by
number,
doing
launches
this.
alert.
But why do we want to
Dylan
make
Barrow.
somebody? Why do we want to make somebody have to go through that interaction when we can just very easily
Name, Josh McMeeking. Phone number 734-645.
and we have
5506. Button.
and we have all of that
Launches
information. Oh, and there's a hint at the end, right? We're going to launches alert. And we have all of that information in one cell. And like I said, there's little to no downside for keyboard users. And for touch to explore users, this creates a really, really simple, usable interface. And we haven't lost any functionality here. There is no functionality loss between these two examples. The time when separate elements matter, like I said, if we need to interact, if we have more than one button in here, for example, or we have a text field where we want to be able to enter a new number, then we have to separate the user. We have to separate those accessibility elements. That's why I'm mentioning it as an option. Otherwise, I think the idea of having it be one cell is so much more usable, so simple. Unless you have really, really complex data sets, you can represent all that information very quickly, and it's all. And there's no, like I said, for touch to explore users, there's no way you're gonna shift to the wrong option or get the wrong data. So you can implement it either way. So the question is, when you have these accessibility elements, does this affect the way a non-VoiceOver user interacts with the application? Is that a good summary? So basically, it doesn't affect it at all.
VoiceOver off.
So I'm going to tap on the fields here. No interaction, right? I tap on the button. Go away. Doesn't affect it at all. All VoiceOver is a very specific layer. It only concerns about those accessibility elements. It has no effect on the standard user's interaction with an application at all. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. I don't believe in iOS that there is a way to mix and match. And like I said, if you, I think I mentioned, if you have really, really complex data sets, it is a good idea to separate them for that example. I think when your example is something simple like 2 or 3 fields, that having them all in one doesn't provide that much inconvenience. It is significantly more usable for touch to explore users. But there isn't, this is an opinion that I have. There is absolutely, they're both correct ways of doing the same thing. That is a good argument for not doing it. Like I said, that this is more usable. It's an opinion. It's 2 ways of accomplishing this idea of data association. I just am presenting both ways of doing it. Whichever your situation provides, they're both equally accessible. And like I said, for a touch to explore user to scan over an option and then flick, it's not that big of an inconvenience. It's just, this is a cool way of doing it that makes it really, really usable. Go ahead. Right corner. Okay, so what her comment was you can go word for word. You can in VoiceOver, there are gestures so that you can take an accessibility element and go over its label piece by piece. That's an excellent point. Thank you. So the question was if the user leaves and re-enters a region, if they're gonna read over all of the information again, or start essentially from where they left off, or the that information is absolutely gonna be read off in completion every time. Um, um, Unless you're using like what she said mentioned, where you can go in and analyze an individual elements of the label. But as far as entering the label, the whole label is treated as one accessibility element. This whole thing gets read off every time. What I have set up there, if we when we dig into the code of the example, is so those fields, you don't need to support any type of selection on that example, right? So what I did is I overrode the on select listener, and when you select it, it executes the button's action, right? Anything else? All right, let's dig into how I implemented those and in our code here. Oh, where are you? I remembered. All right. So when we're talking about separate elements, that first example, what we want to do is we want to implement the UI accessibility container protocol. This has 3 functions. One of them is going to return an integer. It's the count of accessibility elements, the number of elements within that container. One of them is the accessibility element at index. You're going to return an ID of the actual element. In this case, it's going to be one of our 2 label fields or that button. And then we're going to get the index of accessibility element. This is the converse. We're gonna accept an accessibility element as an argument, and we're going to return its index within that cell. I'm running out of time. So let's go over this real quick. So here are the implementations. They're really pretty simple. We're gonna define a function that populates accessibility elements. The reason I define it as a function and not like a property is because I want this to inherently support dynamic content, right? And so if we could define this, we can define any number of elements in here, and we'll inherently support that dynamic content. It's a little less performant, but I think that inherent support of dynamic content overrides that. And the rest of these are very, very simple. You're returning the count of elements, you're returning the object at an index, you're finding the index of an object. The only other thing that I want to draw your attention to is down at the bottom here. Is accessibility element, we have to return no. If we don't return no, we're gonna potentially skip to where we have that accessibility element. Remember, if we have an accessibility element, the accessibility elements inside will not get focused by VoiceOver. All right. The last thing we have here on this one is I have a special labels class for the columns, so that what we can do is we're gonna define this accessibility label function. Somebody had a question about that earlier. We're gonna define this accessibility label function, so that way we're gonna build this string every time we enter that field. A, we're supporting dynamic content, and B, we can append this nice little header, right? We can append that name so that we get the name of somebody. It's the name is announced, and then their actual name is announced, and then all we're going to do is return the accessibility element, yes. And then you'll find in my example, you'll find a DQ alley UI label call to, which is just going to replace the name text with the number text instead. Right. Okay. So the question is VoiceOver going to pick that up as an event or not the new one? And here's the way it works. Every time, and this is why we define the function and not define the label, because when we define the function, VoiceOver is going to call this accessibility label function every time it announces that element, right? Every time that it gets every time it wants the accessibility information from an element, is going to call this function. So we're inherently supporting dynamic context, because if it's changed, if the text in this label, this self text, if that is changed since the last time we interacted with it, it's going to get that updated text automatically. Automatic support of dynamic elements, really powerful. Absolutely. Yep. All right, now let's talk about the one alley element implementation. 5 minutes. All right, I will hurry. So what we have is we have the UI accessibility protocol, is accessibility element, accessibility label, accessibility hint. This is all in the example. So what I do here, I want to draw attention to one thing, and that is we have this accessibility, this big accessibility label function, and this is where we're gathering all of that information. And again, remember, one of the things I've emphasized is automatic support of dynamic content. That's exactly what we're doing here. So what we're going to do is we're going to grab the first label, we're going to grab the second label, we have the name, we plug in the name down here. Notice our name is the first argument on that format string. So we have the name, and then we have the phone number. The phone number is the second argument on that format string. And then we return accessibility traits. And then the other thing at the top is we're going to always return yes for whether it's an accessibility label or not. Any questions? We have time for a couple quick questions. No. That's the XML in mobile is purely interpreted by the background system. It's not in any way related to doc type or anything like that. Anything else? Go ahead up front. Yep. Yep. I have not used the switch control or developed for it directly. My inclination would be that all the switch control is going to do is those swipe options that you have for going back and forth. It's just gonna emulate whatever those controls are. Again, that's just an educated guess. I haven't actually used that mechanism. So I am out of time, as I can tell. So thanks, guys.